hello, 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 hello. So, tonight I have a special video for you guys, completely inspired by, I think his name is Siege. Not his real name. I assume his channel. I'll put it in the description, but I watched his video, one of his videos saying goodnight to cities in the United States. Last night, the night before, something very recently, and I loved it. It was so much fun. So I wanted to do it for you guys. Also, I painted my nails. They look like garbage, but they're glittery. And you can't really tell, but they're kind of holographic. In this lighting, it doesn't look like it. It just looks green. Like the glitter just looks green, but anyways, cities. So I'm only doing cities in the United States right now, just because I needed to limit it, and a lot of my viewers are from the US, so we're gonna start there, and then if you guys want, if you're from other places, tell me, and I can do a video, like, more specifically for each of you guys. So, without further ado, you are not allowed to go to sleep until I say your city, and if I don't say your city, you have to go watch another one of my videos. Sorry. Them's the rules. Okay. First, and these are the largest, like the biggest cities in the US. So, if your city's not on here, I don't know what to tell you. I've probably never heard of it. But you can tell me it anyways, and I'll put it in another video. Okay. First, good night to New York City. New York City, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York City. Good night, good night, good night, good night, good night to New York. I've never been. I want to go. I want to go so bad. One day. Next. Good night to Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles, California, Los Angeles, California. I have a friend who lives in Los Angeles, California. So, and I know she watches my videos. Hi, Ree. So, Ree, good night, good night, good night, good night, Los Angeles, California. Good night, Los Angeles, Los Angeles, Los Angeles, Los Angeles. Good night, Chicago, 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 Illinois. Good night, Chicago, Illinois. Chicago, Illinois, Chicago, Illinois. Good night, good night, good night. Good night, Houston, Texas. There's gonna be a lot of Texas on here. I can already feel it. I think most cities in Texas are pretty big. Good night, Houston, 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 Texas. I don't know anyone in Houston. I think Water Parks, the band, is from Houston. Good night, Water Parks. Good night, Houston, 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 Houston. Ooh, good night, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, 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 Arizona. Good night, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. Fun fact about me, I was born in Arizona, not Phoenix. I'm not gonna tell you where. I was born in Arizona. Good night, Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona. Is that where Bella from Twilight is from? I think she's from Phoenix. Good night, Bella. Good night, Bella Swan. Good night, Philadelphia. Oh my god, so many in Philadelphia. Good night, Philadelphia. Good night, Charlie What do you mean? Like, what do you mean Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are both in Pennsylvania? What do you mean? That's how I feel right now. Because I'm pretty sure Pittsburgh is probably on here too. Good night, San Antonio, Texas. Yup, another Texas. San Antonio, good night, San Antonio. Where is San Antonio, Texas? I don't even really know where Houston is. I know where Dallas and Fort Worth are. I play a lot of GeoGuessr. Good night, San Antonio. Good night, San Antonio. Good night, San Antonio. Good night, San Diego. Do I sound like Melman? San Diego. Good night, San Diego. Good night, San Diego. Every time I hear it, I hear Sandy Ego. Good night, San Diego. Good night, Dallas, Texas. Another Texas. Good night. Oh my gosh. Good night, Dallas. Good night, Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas. Oh my god, my nose is always running when I'm filming. Good night to the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. Good night, Jacksonville, Florida. Good night, Jacksonville, Florida. Good night, Jacksonville, Florida. Oh my goodness. Good night, Jacksonville, Florida. Good night, Jacksonville, Florida. Good night, Austin, Texas. How many cities are in Texas? So many. Oh my god. And next is Fort Worth. Good night, Fort Worth. Let me ask you guys a question from Fort Worth. Why is it its own city? Why is it not just Dallas? Because, like, in most other big cities, you kind of just say you're from the city, like the big city. I don't know if that makes any sense. Good night, San Jose, California. San Jose, California. Good night, San Jose, California. Good night, Columbus, Ohio. Good night, Columbus, Ohio. I do not like Columbus, Ohio. Oh, sorry. We have personal beef, you and I, Columbus, Ohio, but I guess good night to you. Good night, Columbus, Ohio. Good night, Columbus, Ohio. I think my dad actually went to school in Columbus for a couple of years. Way back when. Good night, Columbus, Ohio. Good night, Charlotte, North Carolina. Good night to Charlotte, North Carolina. And if your name is Charlotte, you're winning. You're winning tonight. Good night, Charlotte. Are there any Charlottes that live in Charlotte, North Carolina? Good night, Indianapolis, Indiana. How does it feel to be the only city in that state that matters? Just kidding. I'm kidding. Good night, Indianapolis. my favorites. Nashville. Good night, Nashville. Good night to Nashville. Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee. I love Tennessee. Big fan. Personally, a big fan of Tennessee. Good night, Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee. I always have the best time in Nashville. And, I love country music and cowboys and, getting really drunk on Broadway Street. And I like live music, so perfect city. Absolutely perfect city. Good night to Nashville. Good night to all of the bands I've seen in bars in Nashville. Good night, Washington, D.C. You guys have got a lot going on at the moment. Good night, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. I find it crazy that people actually live there, you know? Does that make sense? I didn't know that people actually lived in Washington, and that it was so populated. I thought that people just worked there, and it was just like the president and like people that worked in the government. But I guess there's a lot of other people that live there. I guess their families and stuff too, but good night, Washington, D.C. Good night, El Paso, El Paso, El Paso, Texas. El Paso, El Paso, El Paso, El Paso, Texas. Good night, good night, good night, El Paso, Texas. Good night, Las Vegas, Nevada. I've never been to Las Vegas. I want to go to Vegas so bad. My grandparents go every year. Good night, good night, good night to Las Vegas. Las Vegas. I know Zach Bagans is from Vegas. Good night to Zach Bagans of Ghost Adventures fame. Good night, Zach Bagans. Good night to everyone visiting the Zach Bagans Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, Nevada. Tell me how it is. Good night, Las Vegas, Las Vegas. Good night, Boston, Massachusetts. Boston, Massachusetts. Boston, Massachusetts. Isn't that where Sweet Life of Zach and Cody is? Good night to Zach and Cody Martin. Good night, good night, good night to Boston, 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 Massachusetts. Boston, Massachusetts, 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 Boston, Boston, Boston. Your airport is crazy expensive to fly into. And you're so far away from all the places that I want to go in Massachusetts, so lose-lose situation. Good night to Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan. I don't have any Detroit lore. Good night, Detroit, Michigan. Oh, there's a lot of geoguesser spots in Detroit, believe it or not. Like, a lot. Every single game I play in the U.S., there's one in Michigan, and it's usually around Detroit. Good night, Detroit, 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 Michigan, Detroit, Detroit, Michigan. Good night, Portland, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Portland, Oregon. Oh my goodness. Portland, Oregon, Portland, 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 Oregon. Portland, Oregon. Good night to Portland, 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 Oregon. Portland, 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 Oregon. Good night to Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, 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 Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville, 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 Kentucky. Louisville, 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 Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. Good night to Louisville, actually is a good trigger word, I think. Good night to Louisville, Kentucky. And it's pronounced that way, by the way. Good night to Memphis, Tennessee it is. Memphis, Tennessee. Good night to Memphis, Tennessee. There's a new Mason Ramsey song. It's not really that new. He goes, I'd run all the way to Memphis, cross the Tennessee line with you on my mind. It's true. I'd swim the Mississippi just to see your face or something. I don't know. Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis, Memphis, Tennessee. Good night to Memphis, Tennessee. Good night to Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland. Good night to Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland. Good night to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You guys have had a lot. Good night to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The urge to not talk about crimes that I know have happened in each of these cities is strong. Good night, good night, good night, good night, good night, good night, good night to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Ooh, Albuquerque. Albuquerque is a fun one. Good night, good night, good night, good night, good night to Albuquerque. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Is that where High School Musical takes place? Albuquerque, New Mexico. Good night to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque, New Mexico. I find it hard to believe that's how that's actually supposed to be pronounced, because it's not spelled that way. Tucson, Arizona. Good night, good night, good night, good night to Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona. Good night to Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona. Good night to Fresno, California. Fresno, California. Fresno, California. The Fresno Nightcrawlers are not Fresno, California, are they? I thought they were somewhere else, because there's not a lot of cryptid sightings that happen in California, I feel like. But if it is, and someone knows, please let me know. I'll probably look it up, but you can let me know anyways. Well, Fresno, California. If the Nightcrawlers are in Fresno, good night to the Fresno Nightcrawlers. The Fresno Nightcrawlers. Those little guys that just look like walking pants, I think. They little pants. I think. Good night to Sacramento, California. Sacramento, California. Good night to Sacramento, California. Sacramento, California. Sacramento, California. Good night to Mesa, Arizona. I actually forgot about Mesa, Arizona. I'm kind of surprised that it's up here above a bunch of these cities that I would not have guessed. Good night to Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Hotlanta. Good night, Hotlanta. Good night, good night, good night to Atlanta, Georgia. Your traffic is god awful. Literally a circle of hell, I think. Good night, good night, good night to Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia's a beautiful state, though. I love Georgia, but I gotta visit, not Atlanta. Good night, Atlanta, Georgia. My hands. Good night to Kansas City, Missouri. You confuse me. Kansas City, Missouri. Why are you not in Kansas? Good night, good night, good night, Kansas City, Missouri. Good night, Travis Kelce. That's the only thing I know. Good night, good night, good night. Anyone who's a fan of football just unsubscribed from me. Sorry, I don't care. I don't care about football. But my dad likes the Chiefs. Good night to the Kansas City Chiefs. Good night, Kansas City, Missouri. Colorado Springs, Colorado. Good night to Colorado Springs. Good night, Colorado Springs. Good night, Colorado, 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 Colorado Springs. Good night, Colorado Springs. Good night, Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh. Good night, Raleigh, North Carolina. If I die in Raleigh, at least I will die free. So rock me, mama, like a wagon wheel. Rock me, mama, any way you feel. Hey, mama, rock me. Good night, Raleigh, 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 North Carolina. Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh, North Carolina. Okay. Good night, Miami, Florida. Miami, Florida. Good night, Miami, Florida. Good night, Miami, Florida. Good night. Good night, good night, good night, good night, Miami, Florida. Good night, Miami, Florida. Good night, Virginia Beach, Virginia. Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach. Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach. Good night, Long Beach, California. Long Beach, I think I know where Long Beach is. Good night to Long Beach, California. Long Beach, California. Long Beach, California. Long Beach. I'm gonna start zooming through some of these. Good night, Oakland, 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 California. Good night, Oakland, California. Oakland, California. Oakland, California. Oakland, California. If you're in California right now, what's the weather like? I know that it's different, north and south. But it's so hot where I live. And I'm pretty sure West Coast is not like that. So let me know. If I say your city, let me know in the comments, and also tell me what the weather's like. Good night, Minneapolis. Minneapolis. Where's Minneapolis? Hold on. Minnesota. Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're going with it. If I'm wrong, sorry. I don't know much about those states up there. Good night, Minneapolis, Minneapolis, Minneapolis. Good night, 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 Bakersfield, California. Bakersfield, California. Bakersfield, Bakersfield. Tampon, Florida. Good night, Tampon, Florida. Good night, Arlington, Texas. Arlington, Texas. Arlington, Arlington, Arlington. Arlington, 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 Texas. Arlington, Texas. Good night, Wichita, Kansas. Wichita, 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 Kansas. Wichita, Kansas. Good night, Aurora, Colorado. I've never heard of Aurora, Colorado. That's so cool. Good night, Aurora, Colorado. Aurora, Colorado. Aurora. Good night, Aurora. Good night, New Orleans, Louisiana. Another favorite of mine. Good night, good night, good night, New Orleans. Good night, Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Good night. Good night, good night, good night, New Orleans. Good night, New Orleans. Oh my god, what am I saying? So many California ones. New Orleans, Louisiana. Good night, Louisiana. New Orleans, Louisiana. Good night to anyone on Bourbon Street right now. Good night, New Orleans. Good night to all the ghosts. Good night, Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio. I don't think I've ever been to Cleveland because it's up north. It's too far north. I don't go to Ohio. I don't go to Ohio anyways, but I don't have beef with Cleveland the way that I do Columbus though, so good night to Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio. Good night to Cleveland, Ohio. Good night to Cleveland, Ohio. Good night to Honolulu, Hawaii. Honolulu, Hawaii. How do you even say it? It's more like Hawaii or something. I don't really know. I want to say things correctly because, that's like respectful, but I don't know. Honolulu, Hawaii. Good night, Honolulu, Hawaii. Good night, Honolulu, 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 Honolulu. Good night, Anaheim, California. Anaheim, California. Good night, Anaheim, California. Good night, Anaheim, California. Good night, Anaheim, California. Good night, Henderson, Nevada. What a random place. Good night, Henderson, Nevada. Henderson, Nevada. Good night, Orlando, Florida. Good night, Orlando, Florida. I have a friend in Orlando, Florida. Good night, Laura. I know she subscribed. Good night, Orlando, Florida. Good night, Orlando, Florida. Orlando, Florida. Orlando, Florida. Orlando, Florida. Good night, Lexington, Kentucky. Good night, Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky. And those are the only two cities in Kentucky that are going to be on this list. I'm calling it right now. Good night, Lexington, Kentucky. Good night, Lexington, Kentucky. Maybe Richmond, I don't know. Good night, Lexington, Kentucky. Isn't Amberlynn Reed from Lexington? Is she? Or I think the Slayton sisters might have been from Kentucky. Am I making things up? Am I making things up right now? I do know Paul and Morgan, psychos on YouTube, are from Lexington. I know that much. Stockton, California. Good night, Stockton, a city. Good night, Riverside, California. Riverside, California. Good night, Riverside, California. Good night, Corpus Christi, Texas. Good night. Good night, Corpus Christi, Texas. Corpus Christi. Good night, Irvine, California. Where the heck is Irvine, California? Good night, Irvine, California. Good night, Cincinnati, Ohio. Good night, Cincinnati, Ohio. Your zoo is pretty cool. Good night to all of the red pandas in the Cincinnati Zoo. Good night, Cincinnati. Good night, Santa Ana, California. Good night, Santa Ana, California. Santa Ana, California. Good night, Newark, New Jersey. Newark. I know that it's more like Newark and not like Newark. It's like Newark. I don't know. Newark. No, oh my god, again. Newark, New Jersey. Good night, St. Paul, Minnesota. Good night, St. Paul. Whoopsie. St. Paul. Good night, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Good night, dance moms. Good night, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Good night, Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro, North Carolina. Good night, Durham, North Carolina. Durham. Oh my gosh, this is getting harder to talk. Good night, Durham, North Carolina. What is N-E? Nebraska? Is that Nebraska? Good night, Lincoln, Nebraska, I think. Good night, Lincoln, Nebraska. Good night, Jersey City, New Jersey. Good night, Jersey City. Good night, Jersey City, New Jersey. Good night, Jersey City. Is this Plano, Texas? Plano, I think, maybe. I don't know. Plano sounds more like a city. Plano, Texas. Good night, Plano, Texas. Good night, Plano, Texas. One of my posters on my wall is falling off. Good night, Plano, Texas. Good night, Anchorage, Alaska. I want to live in Alaska so bad. Chris McCandles is my hero. So that's like half a joke, half not. Good night, Anchorage, Alaska. Good night, Anchorage, Alaska. Good night, St. Louis, Missouri. they have got the big arch. St. Louis, the gateway to the west. Is that what it is? I think so. St. Louis, with the gateway arch. St. Louis. Good night to Madison, Wisconsin. And once again, if your name is Madison, you're winning. I have a friend named Madison. Good night, Madison. Good night, Madison, Wisconsin. Up next is Chandler, Arizona, which I almost feel like I think is where I was born. I think so. Chandler, Arizona. Good night to Chandler, Arizona. Yours truly might have been born there. Chandler, Arizona. I didn't expect Chandler to be so populated, honestly. Chandler, Arizona. Good night, Gilbert, Arizona. That one's gotta be made up. Gilbert, Arizona. Gilbert, Arizona. And Reno, Nevada. Reno, Nevada. Good night to Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York. Good night to Buffalo, New York. Good night to Chula Vista, California. What is that? Good night to Chula Vista. Chula Vista. Good night to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Good night, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Good night, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Fort Wayne, Indiana. Good night, Lubbock, Texas. Lubbock, Texas. Lubbock, Texas. Good night, Toledo, Ohio. If you're from Toledo, Ohio, I know exactly what your voice sounds like. I just know. I know the accent. Toledo sounds like it's so much farther north than like just Ohio. It feels like it has to be like Wisconsin or something. Good night, Toledo, Ohio. Good night, St. Petersburg, Florida. Good night, St. Pete. Good night, St. Pete. Good night, St. Pete. St. Petersburg. Good night, St. Pete. Good night, Laredo, Texas. Laredo, Texas. Good night, Laredo, Texas. Oh. Good night, Irving, Texas. I'm telling you, every city in Texas is big. Irving, Texas. Irving, Texas. Irving, Texas. Good night, Irving, Texas. Good night, Chesapeake, 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 Virginia. Chesapeake, Virginia. Chesapeake, Virginia. Like the Chesapeake Bay. Can you get clam chowder there? Chesapeake, 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 Virginia. Good night, Glendale, Arizona. Glendale, Arizona. Glendale, Glendale. Glendale, Arizona. Glendale, Arizona. Good night, Boise, Idaho. Boise, Idaho. Boise, Idaho. Boise, Idaho. Boise, Idaho. Boise, 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 Boise. Boise, 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 Idaho. Boise, Idaho. Good night, Boise, Idaho. Good night, Norfolk, right? Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk. I'm gonna say a bad word on accident. Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, Virginia. Good night. Spokane. This is Spokane, Washington. Spokane? I don't know. I heard Neve Schulman say it once, and I don't know if he was right or not. He calls it Spokane, I think. Spokane. Spokane, Washington. Good night, Spokane. Good night, Richmond, Virginia. Good night, Richmond, Virginia. Good night, Richmond, Virginia. I'm just scrolling through, seeing what else is on here, honestly, because I'm not getting all of them, obviously. There's so many, but back up. Okay, Fremont, California. Fremont, California. Good night to Fremont, California. Fremont, California. Good night to Fremont, California. And last one for tonight, is gonna be Huntsville, Alabama. Good night to Huntsville, Alabama. I don't know anything about Alabama. What's the capital? I don't know. I don't know if it's Huntsville. Where's Alabama State? Where does Bama Rush happen? Good night to Huntsville, Alabama. Good night to Huntsville, Alabama. Arkansas. I do love my mom and pa, not the way that I do love you. Whatever. Okay, that's gonna be it for tonight, you guys. And I hope that I said your city. And if I didn't, I told you, you have to tell me your city, and then you have to